Hello everyone and welcome to my channel. This video is the beginning of a new series that I'm going to be working on, meant to highlight some odd and intriguing retro games that have since been almost entirely forgotten. As the video game medium has moved steadily forward since the 1970s, more and more video game software is developed only to fade quickly into obscurity. Some of these games are quite unique, interesting, or mysterious, but have simply been lost to the passage of time. These are the games that I'm going to focus on for this series, highlighting their gameplay, history, what makes them special, and why they were lost or overlooked. Today I'm going to start the series with a game that has a very interesting mystery behind it, Entombed, for the Atari 2600. Entombed was released in 1982, developed by Western Technologies, published by US Games, and mostly programmed by a man named Stephen Sidley. On the surface, this game is really nothing special. Essentially, Entombed was just another average entry in an overly large segment of maze games that released in the early 80s. In 1982 alone, the same year that Entombed released, at least 18 other commercially developed maze games were also introduced, many of them for the Atari. If you also include Pac-Man knockoff games, this number jumps to a staggering 56. As a result, Entombed was quickly forgotten and left out of video game history, at least until 2016, when the University of Calgary in Alberta, Canada, decided to dissect its code and discovered something extremely unusual. The gameplay of Entombed, just like most other Atari 2600 titles, is extremely simple. You play as a small human-shaped sprite, and you have to work your way through an unending and procedurally generated maze. As the game progresses, you are forced to move through mazes faster and faster as they scroll. If your character ends up off-screen, you lose. There are also enemies that need to be avoided. You have a limited ability to break down walls or to create new ones, and have to collect power-ups in order to continue using this ability, which can get you out of potential tight spots. Although fun, the gameplay isn't anything special or very memorable. During the age of the Atari 2600, maze games like Entombed had to be procedurally generated. This means that instead of having pre-planned mazes designed specifically for the game, an algorithm would be used to create the maze on the fly every time the game was played. As a result, the game would be different every single time you'd play it. This technique was used for a very simple reason. Atari 2600 cartridges did not have enough storage for pre-planned mazes, but they could easily store an algorithm. When researchers at the University of Calgary began looking at Entombed's code in an effort to use clever solutions from old games in order to solve problems that plague new ones, they realized that Entombed's procedural generation algorithm was completely unique. In the early days of gaming, procedural generation algorithms were typically extremely flawed, and would often create levels or areas that were impossible to pass or escape from, and would require the player to restart the game. A great example of this problem is Bethesda's second Elder Scrolls game, Daggerfall, which had procedural generation that would often keep players from being able to physically reach important quest items that were required for the main story to be finished, making the game nearly unplayable to completion. Daggerfall was built with a much larger budget than Entombed, and it was released in 1997, nearly 20 years after Entombed released, and it still couldn't get procedural generation to work properly. Amazingly, Entombed never had any of these problems with its procedural generation. Its mazes always worked perfectly, and there was always a way out. How did Entombed solve this complicated problem? Well, nobody really knows. Entombed's procedural generation algorithm is a complete mystery, and seemingly a work of mad genius. Even after extensive study, no one can figure out how it actually works. By all accounts, it shouldn't function at all. After the researchers at the University of Calgary were completely stumped by the code, they decided to interview the head programmer himself, Stephen Sidley. What follows is Sidley's complete response. The basic maze generating routine had been partially written by a stoner who had left the company. I contacted him to try and understand what the maze generating algorithm did. He told me that it came upon him when he was drunk and whacked out of his brain, and he coded it up in assembly overnight before he passed out, but now could not for the life of him remember how the algorithm worked. That means that not only was Sidney unable to tell the researchers how the algorithm worked, but he didn't even remember the name of the person who designed it. Worse yet, the designer was so inebriated that he had forgotten how the code worked by the very next day. He left no comments in the code and has effectively guaranteed that the algorithm will remain a mystery forever. Entombed has advanced procedural generation that could have helped the modern game designers create better modern procedurally generated worlds. But the code, written in a fit of potential genius by a man in an alternate state of mind, is completely undecipherable even all these years later. Going back and playing Entombed after knowing about the unsolvable mystery behind its code makes playing the game a more exciting experience. The game may seem simple and generic on the surface, but the code behind it all remains a retro video game conundrum that may never be cracked. If you like retro games, lost software, and interesting game mysteries, keep your eyes open for the next videos in this series. Remember, it's up to us to keep these games from disappearing forever.